sorry about that. I guess we could say that's an inauspicious way to start this meeting. For everybody who's on the line, if you have both the telephone on and your PC, I'd appreciate it if you would mute your PC so we don't have another occurrence of that. Otherwise, I'll just mute the entire audience if we have very much background noise. With that, I'm going to let my sponsor, Kimberly, say a few words.
All right. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in today's FSIS Learning Trove event. And today's event is in honor of Administrative Professionals Week. Again, my name is Kimberly Monse, and I am a training and program specialist in OE with the Organization and Employee Development Branch. As the Learning Trove Program Manager, I was very excited to assist with this event today, and I am very honored to introduce and present my colleague, Mr. Tom Walsh, who will be giving us some very timely do's and don'ts about time management. I hope you can see what I did there, but I always like to begin our webinar, with some housekeeping items. Yesterday in the email that I sent out with the PowerPoint and the attachments, if you scroll all the way down that email on the very bottom before my signature, you will see a survey link. Our feedback is very, very important to us. We love to hear what we're doing great. We love to hear what we can do better. So if you can fill out that survey by this Friday, April 29th, close of business, and give us your feedback, we would greatly appreciate it, and we will ensure that you are given credit in AdLearn for attending today's session. If you have attended any webinars that Tom has facilitated in the past, he is very interactive, so you have plenty of opportunities throughout the presentation to ask any questions or have any comments that you have. But obviously at the very end of the webinar, we will open the line or take any questions in the chat box that you would like to submit. And with that, now I will turn it over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. As I mentioned before, there is an outstanding warning that if we get background noise, I will just mute everyone. However, until such time, I just soon leave the lines open so somebody can raise a question verbally if they wish. Also, I should let you know that we are recording this session. The idea is we like to be able to review it and make sure that we're improving as we submit all of these for your education, but also in some cases we've made previous webinars available for reuse. Why deliver the same material twice if we've got a perfectly well copied presentation that's available on demand for just about anybody. With that, I'm going to move on. And for those of you who haven't partaken of a webinar with me, I am a proponent for Adobe Connect. Adobe gives us the ability on the PC to do some really nice training features, one of which is, if you look at the screen or your handout, we've got the bulk of the screen is showing the PowerPoint. That's where we kind of just use that to keep everybody on track. We also have a list of participants. We'll see in a moment that we can be interactive with that list of participants. I can ask for people to raise their hands, to agree, disagree, etc. On the bottom right-hand corner, we've got files. If you notice on the very bottom, there's a little button that says Upload File. You'll have the ability to download any of the files that are on there. You just highlight, such as time management slides, PDF. Then a button for download files will come up, and then you can click on it and download it to your PC if you haven't already gotten it. And then on the bottom left, we've got a chat box. We'll be making use of that in just a very few moments. That will be another way of trying to keep this an interactive session so that I know that everybody is alive out there and participating. So what I'd like you all to do now is let's practice by going up on the top of the screen, and you should see a little man with an arm that's got it up, and if you click on the arrow that points down, you've got the options to raise your hand, agree, disagree, step away, etc. So if you would kindly, out there, raise your hand. And, oh, very good. I've got a lot of people out there raising their hands. Excellent. If you look on the screen, you get to see people who had raised their hand. We're actually starting to be able to now use that as a way of keeping track of what's going on. Again, I appreciate that. And what I'd like everyone to do is now lower their hand. Most excellent. That will be one of the ways during this presentation I will ask to make sure people are alive and kicking. Also, we now have the chat function. And just to get an idea as to where everybody's coming from, appreciate it if you would type in the chat box where you are physically located, state, city, office, what have you. We've got Beltsville, we've got Severn, Maryland, Springdale District Office, Lubbock, Texas. It's nice to see we're going across the country. Council Bluffs, Jackson office again, Athens, Claysburg, Salt Lake City. Oh, wow, Denison, Iowa. Okay, good. This also shows me that everyone knows how to use the chat box and that we have the ability to interact, if you will. Now, do keep in mind that the chat box is there for you to raise questions if you are so inclined. Just be aware, I may not necessarily catch it. Hopefully, Kimberly will be my back set of eyes, so if somebody asks a question and I don't immediately respond to it, that would be a backup. So we've now raised our hands, and we've got lots of hands up there still, and we're going to continue to move on. We practiced the raising of the hand. Now we're going to start the module. Okay, time management. That's the key why we're here. First things first, I've got to say, I don't have all the answers on how to best manage time. I'm just as challenged as you are when it comes to managing time. And I think I'm going to mute us all. There we go. Everybody's been muted. That will probably be best anyway, as a couple people show up late. Again, as I was saying, I don't have all the answers to time management. I'm just as challenged as you are in that I continually am amazed at the end of the day where the time went, and I do try and use some of the examples and suggestions that we're going to cover today. So with that, let's move on. We've got some objectives. The objectives are going to cover things like how do we plan and prioritize our day? How do we overcome procrastination? What can we do to organize our life in some cases, or at least our workspace, to improve the effectiveness of our days? Also something about rituals. I'm kind of interested in that. It's for me, it's a way of developing better work habits, if you will. So what I'd like everyone to do now on the chat box is take a look at these questions. They are one of the handouts that had been sent you. It was called the pre-assignment review. And what I'd like you to do is just type in the chat box what you believe is one of your biggest time wasters. What do you personally think is one of the biggest challenges that you face? Distractions, yes, email. I came from a support environment where I had to respond to the telephone. This was pre-email days, so I'm very much in tune with the fact that we get an email or we get a telephone call. In some cases, we're almost programmed to have to respond, almost Pavlovian type of way of dealing with it. Last-minute requests, yep, that's a good one. That's a good distraction. Getting sidetracked with things I enjoy, yes. That shows up in procrastination. How can we find ways to do something other than that which we're supposed to? Okay, dilly-dally. I'm a firm believer that occasionally we need to distract ourselves, but we need to control it. All work and no play makes somebody a dull person. So we do need at least once an hour to get up and walk around. Consider that a built-in distraction that we need. If nothing more, that's for our health. Social butterflies, oh, they're good ones. Oh, traveling from establishment to establishment. Yeah, that's part and parcel of our work world these days. I spend a little over an hour commuting one way, and there are folks that spend even more time, and that's really a total waste of our constructive capabilities during the day. Employees just stopping by to chat. We won't specifically mention how to control that, but there are ways, one of which is if you are referring to employees stopping by, I'm going to guess you might be a supervisor or at least an administrator, and you may have a way of kind of closing off either your office or your area. In some cases, I've seen where people put flags up, kind of like if I've got a red flag up, don't bother me. Of course, you have to remember to take it down when you're no longer in uninterrupt mode. Okay, yeah, and that's a key one, interruptions which stop your train of thought. People talk about multitasking and the ability to do multiple things. We actually have a presentation that's not part of this where I try and convince folks that multitasking is a lie. Anytime you interrupt the train of thought, you do context switching. You have to store off everything that you were thinking about and then bring it back onto the desk of your mind, if you will, once you finish from that interruption. Schedule changes. We're also in a world today where we have to be able to bend to those. So good. I see we've got some honest people who recognize some of the challenges they live with. I'd like you to take a look at that bottom question, and this is more for me. I'm not going to guarantee that I'll be able to satisfy this, but what I'd like to know is what would be one takeaway that you would like to get out of this session today? So again, if you go back to the chat box and type in one thing that you would like to learn, and I'll see if I can't add it in if it's not already a part of our agenda. Multiple attendees are typing. That's always good to know. People are out there getting ready to give me their opinions. Well, Elizabeth, yes, you'll get many. I can't say all will be considered good. One of the issues is we're all different people and things will work differently for others, but we'll try and supply you as many as we can. Recognize your faults concerning time management. Self-awareness, we had a presentation on that a couple of weeks ago. That's a key, is recognizing your own challenges. Better organization, we'll touch on that for sure. Prioritizing, we'll talk about that. Keep in mind, though, that in some cases, we really are not the driver of our priorities. Things come down to us from above. But for what we can control, yes, we'll talk about how to prioritize that. Priority, again, what tricks to use to manage time? Oh, if I had it simple as tricks, I'd be a millionaire and wouldn't be just speaking to you guys. I'd be lounging somewhere on a beach down in the Caribbean. Oh, well. Make the most of the time you spend at each establishment. We'll talk about that, yes. And not so much concentrating on each one's food safety problems, but yes, while you're at an establishment or at your desk, how can you maximize your time to get the most accomplished. What is the best way to manage emails and phone call interruptions? We'll talk about that a bit. We've got a section on that. And then I'll have my own thoughts. Again, having mentioned that I came from a support position where I literally trained myself to respond to phone calls. Best way to manage all of that. We've got one more typing, and then we'll move on because we do have a time limit for the day. Sitting here with bated breath for Diana to finish. No pressure. No pressure. Busy work versus productive work. Ooh. Okay. That's going to be, I think, mentioned when we get into prioritization. But you've got to keep in mind that things like whether it's busy or productive can sometimes be in the eye of the beholder. And we all work for somebody. Our idea of what they consider a priority may not agree, but we do have to bow to what they say. So, pre-assessment assignment review, very good, thank you. I think we can probably cover a lot of that. Okay, Module 2, as we get into some of the meat here, what we're talking about now is SMART goals, not just SMART themselves, but goals in general. The idea is we need to set goals so we have some place in the future to be able to recognize this is where we're headed. This is the target. This is what we want to accomplish. Okay, and I like the quote up there. The bad news is that time flies. The good news is that you are the pilot. And while we can't always control everything, we're going to try and see what we can do to help pilot ourselves through time a little bit better. When we start talking about goals, one of the first things that we want to mention is the 3 Ps. If you establish and set yourself up a goal, you want them to be positive. Now, when we're talking about this, when we're talking about saying positive goals, we don't want you to say, I want to find a job that's not so boring. That's really not a positive way to say it. Granted, you may want to get a different job, but you want to set the goal up to be, okay, what I want to do is just find a position that utilizes my talents better and that gives me more money. So in other words, focus on the goal for what are the positives you want to get out of it, not the negatives that you want to overcome. If that makes sense, hopefully. Second P is personal. They must be personal. They've got to reflect you, your values. They have to have some kind of a meaning for you that will help drive you in wanting to be successful at it. And then the third is possible. I would love to be able to say one of my goals is to select the winning lotto number and become a multimillionaire. But I've got to be honest, I don't really think that's too terribly possible. At least if I don't have $1 billion to spread and buy enough tickets to guarantee that I'd win it. So when we make the goals, they should be positive, and so they're saying the benefits that we're after, personal, something that will help drive us individually towards the accomplishment, and possible. Make sure that we're doing things or looking for things that we can actually get away with, we can accomplish. Now, here's the SMART part when we're talking about goals, and this also goes back to, in some regards, some of the P's, if you will, possible. If you're going to set up a goal, it should be specific. In other words, don't just say, I'm going to get a promotion. You can be very specific and say, to get a promotion, I am going to attend certain classes, I am going to volunteer for certain positions, I am going to gain certain skill sets. So you want something that is got meat to it that somebody could look at and see that, yes, you are successfully reaching that goal. Measurable. We all need to be able to see how close we're getting. One of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit on priorities is we always need to constantly judge where we are in relation and perhaps make changes. Changes in the direction, changes in the goal. So if we don't measure, we don't know how close we are or how far away we're going from that goal. Achievable. Well, this goes back to the possible that we had on the 3 Ps. It's got to be something that can actually be realistically gotten to. In other words, you don't want to set yourself up for failure. Okay? We have enough failure that comes in our own lives that's outside of our control, so we don't need to set ourselves up for it. Relevant, okay, the R, okay, this needs to kind of be a value, if you will. It's business goals, it's got to be relative to the mission. If it's a personal goal, it's got to be relevant to your values or something that you hold dear. So as long as the goals are in harmony with your life or what your business is, then you'll have a better chance of making them occur. And then lastly, it's got to be timed. This is one of the challenges that comes up, and I've spent a lot of my own time dealing with, is the fact that I want to do something, but I don't set a end point in sight. We all tend to procrastinate, which I'm sorry to say is human nature, I believe. But we all recognize as we get closer to that deliverable time, that's when we really start putting the issue out, the time into something. So if we've got a marker that says it's due by tomorrow, then we can gauge our time and make best use of it to accomplish it. So the SMART way of approaching goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll take hands, just raise them up and say, raised hand if it made sense. Check marks, I'll take those as well. They're in agreement. Good, okay. Always nice to see that when I say some things that they come through. Excellent. Okay, you can all drop your hands again because eventually I'll ask another question. Thank you very much. So, prioritizing these goals. This is one of the issues that we'll spend more time on in a few minutes as well. But the first thing is just the thought that we need to say there's one goal that's probably more important than the others. And if we're going to invest our time on it, we need to make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck. So when we start thinking of which of the goals we're going to work on, it'll be similar to prioritizing our tasks. What's going to give us the biggest either personal gratification for accomplishment or the biggest success in getting towards the mission or best utilization of our time and effort. And going back to the SMART, I had mentioned that one of the things we need to do about goals is measure them. And so we want to keep in mind that we need to evaluate where we're going when we're dealing with these goals, especially as priorities change. We've got to be able to adapt. So we always want to kind of keep track as we shift from goal to goal. How much of it did we complete? How far we got to go? Things like that, so that we're again making the best use, driving towards the outcome that would serve us the best. Now, to help service us, there's a concept called visualization, and this is something that you may have heard a lot of sports figures have made use of. If I recall, I think it was one of Tiger Woods, or at least some golfers' way of preparing when they swung at the little white ball. They would visualize where the ball would land, and then they would kind of let their body take into that visualization to try and make it occur, make it be what they wanted. Some runners will visualize themselves going across the finish line, and that kind of sets in their mind the desire, if you will, the preconcept that this is where I'm going to be, but I have a little bit of work to do to get there, so it makes it personal for them. Now, there's also other things about visualization that we can look at. One is if we become emotionally involved with it, perhaps with a vision board. Okay? One of the ideas of a vision board is, let's say you wanted to get all your plans set up for going to Disney World. I don't know why I picked Disney World, but those who know me probably could figure something out. But you've got your vacation, your family vacation coming up in 6 months, and you need to plan for going on your trip to Disney World. Well, what you could do is get some pictures of Disney World, or you and your family, if you've been there before, of Disney World, and keep them in front of you, perhaps taped to a board, so that way you can see that in gold. Unlike the sports figures, mentally developing the picture of where they want to be, you can use cutouts from magazines, something like that, to build this board that kind of gives you the incentive to want to do the tasks needed to reach the goal. Similarly, there's a list of benefits. This is always a good one, especially there's the old adage of we've got to try and remember we went into this swamp to drain the water out when we find ourselves up to our armpits in alligators. We're fighting off alligators at the moment, but we really just wanted to get the water out. So you've got to keep that list of benefits in front of you as to why do I want to do this as things become more difficult, which they will as we move on. So the idea of visualization, it's trying to help you maintain the drive to reach the goals. Okay, hopefully that all made sense. So the next module, prioritizing your time. I said we were going to talk about prioritizing. We've just done it a little bit on the big side, the goal concept, but now we're going to reach down into a little bit more on the task end, if you will, some of the nuts and bolts for accomplishment of things. And I like, again, this quote we've got here from a former president. What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. We're going to have a interesting matrix that hopefully will help bring that to life a little better. But first, let's talk about something that's called the Pareto rule, or the 80-20 rule. Okay? This was invented by an Italian whose last name was Pareto in Italy back at the turn of the 19th century. And he was an economist who discovered that 20% of the population in Italy owned 80% of the land. Well, he started looking around and noticed, at least at his level, that apparently 20% of the peas in his garden pea pods were responsible for 80% of the peas. So he found that this 80-20 rule showed up at least 2 times in nature, and since then it has become pretty much a recognized reality in life, such that there are some examples I'm going to give you. If we were to think about problems in production, it's been found that approximately 80% of the problems with products when they're being manufactured can be caused by about 20% of production deficits or defects. So by working on and reducing those 20% of the production problems, the 80% of the problems that occurred at the end start going away. Business sales, they talk about 20% of a company's customers are responsible for about 80% of the sales. Okay, looking at employees, 20% of employees in almost any organization are responsible for about 80% of the results of whatever that organization is supposed to do. For project management, it's also been found that the first 20% of an effort put into a project will yield 80% of the project's results. So that's telling us that the first part that we put into it is going to have the biggest bang for the buck. So the next question, I guess, would be, and how could we identify what that 20% is? Well, the suggestion I have found is that what you want to do if you're looking at a problem, let's say, is try and identify all of the possible causes that could be giving you that particular problem, keeping in mind that there's usually more than one, especially over time, and then assign a frequency as to how often does each occur. So in other words, if you've got a challenge and you find that there are 6 different potential causes, however, one of them comes up more often than the others, that might be the one that you would want to address. So the 80-20 rule is you can do a little more research online and find lots of write-ups on Pareto's principle. But it's one of those where you need to be able to try and spend enough time to identify, like we said with the goals, what's going to get you the biggest bang for the buck. So there's the 80-20 rule. Moving on, we mentioned the comment from the quote that Eisenhower gave us about urgent and important. Well, there's a individual who came up with this idea, Stephen Covey, and he created this classic matrix that we have here, where if we look on the left-hand side, we've got boxes that can be urgent. And if we look across the top, we would see that we've got them that could be important. So the top left-hand box is both urgent and important. Now, an example of that might be some kind of a crisis. Okay, if you're family and you've got kids, you've got a crying child. It's urgent because the child is crying, and it's important. Why? Because it's your child. Okay? So that's an example where we have both the urgent and the important. Now, if we go across the top, this is where we run into some changes. It's still considered important in the upper right-hand corner, but it's not urgent. Well, what could be an example of that? One of the big ones that a lot of us run into is it's important that we exercise daily, but is it urgent? Not until we can't fit in our clothes anymore. So again, we look at the top 2 squares. They're both important, but in one case it's important and urgent, and in the other case it's important but not urgent. Now if we go down to the bottom left in this matrix, we've got it's urgent but not important. Now this is where we find ourselves a lot in both business, in the office, and in private life. It's urgent. What would be an example of that? Cell phone, okay? Phone rings. We've got emails coming in, okay? They are urgent because they need to be done, or at least they're vying for our attention in our face. They're ringing at us. They're nudging us. But they're not necessarily important. One of the better ways of controlling people's time, I learned from a young manager that I had the pleasure of coaching some time ago, was she effectively blocked out 2 hours a day of her day and shut her door and pretty much had a little sign outside that said, "Do not disturb." What she did for that 2 hours was she did the important things that weren't necessarily urgent, but they needed to be done. So it was kind of like doing the exercise. And for her, that was when she blocked off time to do her email. So emails would come in before that 2-hour block, and they would come in afterwards, but they were not necessarily being responded to because they may be urgent, but they were not necessarily important. And then we've got over on the bottom right-hand side, this is where we kind of spend a lot of time perhaps dilly-dallying. It's neither urgent nor important. So what I'd like to suggest is you develop your own matrix. Just take a piece of paper, draw 2 lines through it, creating the boxes. And then in the upper left-hand corner, write down what is urgent and important in your life, be it at work or at home. And then fill in on the right-hand box, upper one, what's important but not urgent. Then down on the bottom left, what's urgent, what's constantly in your face but is not important. And then let everything else fill in the bottom right. Now you're at least going to be able to start identifying where you need to start putting your energy into work. Does this make sense to everybody? Let's see an agree or a disagree in your hands. Good. Okay. We're on a roll. Thank you very much. You can clear your hands out. Now, this could be a challenge to some people. The concept of being assertive, first off, we need to make sure that you understand this is not being aggressive. Okay? On a continuum, you've got being aggressive on the right. That's where you're in people's faces. You've got passive on the left. That's where you're letting folks walk all over you. Well, being assertive is being in the middle. It's where you're not going to impose yourself on somebody, but you're also not going to let them impose themselves on you. So by being assertive, you can approach this in a couple of different ways. Somebody requests your time. They want you to do something. Well, you can give them an honest explanation, such as, okay, I feel uncomfortable doing that because perhaps there may be an ethical issue here, and you just need to respond back to them that, this is making you uncomfortable. Give them then the chance to perhaps explain why their thought process is different from yours, okay? You can also say no and then briefly clarify your reasoning without making excuses. An example for that could be, I can't do it right now because I've got another project that's due by 5 this afternoon. Most reasonable people would recognize the fact that there's a time crunch that you're under. You're not making an excuse, you're just stating a fact. Your request can be deferred till tomorrow or the next day, but I've got something that needs my attention right now because it's due this afternoon. So an honest explanation, in some case clarifying your reasoning why you can't do something. One of my favorites is give an alternative. Okay, here what we're trying to do is help the person understand that may be other ways to accomplish this without actually having to put them off. I learned about this when I worked in the private sector working with salespeople. They did not like hearing me say, no, the product can't do that. So they would always press me, okay, well, fine, the product can't do it, but the customer wants X. How can we help them get that X that they're looking for, whatever it is? So when you say no, you try and give the individual an alternative, such as, did you think about contacting so-and-so? Or did you think about looking at this? Showing that, yes, it's important, but again, you're having to say no. And then finally, an assertive refusal. This is kind of where you have to put your foot down because there's some cases where you may have to just repeat it a couple of times. This may be most appropriate if you're dealing with somebody who's aggressive or manipulative, okay? An example would be, I understand how you feel, but I will not or cannot do what you're asking for. There you're not giving a reason, you're just effectively saying no. Now again, this may be uncomfortable for some people, and also since this is a week for administrative folks, this might be very difficult to try and say no, but we're giving you hopefully some ideas as to how you can say no, but yet not make somebody that terribly unhappy with you. Hopefully that made sense. I'm not going to ask for hands this time. I'm just going to move on. Planning. We're looking here at planning. And this is where we've got another quote that I'm kind of liking. A work well begun is half ended. Part of planning we'll see is actually just starting and getting out there and doing something. Hallmark of successful time management is consistently being productive each day. And a plan will help. We're going to look at some ways in which that can be accomplished. And the first of which is they're talking here about creating a productivity journal. It could be a notebook. And the suggestion is prioritize tasks, cross off completed tasks, and then carry over unfinished tasks. Now this can be something as elaborate as a day timer. We've all seen those of 3-ring binders, that Franklin day timers that are loaded with different types of pages for how to keep notes of what you do and what you're planning. It can also be as simple as just a index card, a 3x5 index card. The key is trying to set it up such that you begin the day with a list of tasks that you need to accomplish and having some kind of a prioritized schedule set to them, or maybe it's just a time basis. But one of the nice things that I found by using this approach is kind of a journal, and you could even find that there are things for apps on smartphones that do the same thing, making it easy that you don't have to carry something else with you, is that at the end of the day, I mean, I may have done a whole lot of work and I feel exceedingly tired, but to be honest, I can't remember what the hell I did. So it's nice to be able to then go back and look at that notebook or that app on your phone or that index card and see the check marks that will help remind you as to what you did do. Because part of having a journal is, guess what? We're going to suggest that you may want to think about doing it the night before the following day. That way, as you finish up today, you make a plan for the next day. So maximizing the power of your journal. The idea here is, okay, plan the night before. Again, keep the journal with you. It doesn't, again, have to be as big as that Franklin day timer. It could be an index card or an app on your smartphone. It helps give you a sense of satisfaction seeing that you are making progress. Because, again, especially with a lot of tasks for a given goal, we may find ourselves, forgetting that we did do those things. And it gives a great feeling of accomplishment. And then the suggestion at the bottom down here is if you postponed a particular task 3 times, then maybe it's really not as important as we thought it was. Or at least that's what they'd like us to get the idea of here. Okay? So if you find yourself moving over a couple of days, you may want to ask, is it really that important? And what value does it have to actually accomplishing the goal? Because if it can be postponed 3 times, then it may not really be as important as we originally thought. Okay. Now this is a conceptual way of looking at things. And just think about, visualize having a mayonnaise jar or a peanut butter jar, if you will, in front of you that's empty. What you want to do is when you make that journal or that set of plans, the idea here is to put the big things that you need to accomplish and fit as many as you can into that container. So in this case, that would be the rocks. Those would be the big tasks that have milestones attached to them, perhaps. Then the next thing is in this jar, you'd want to try and fill in the spaces between the rocks with pebbles. The pebbles might be smaller tasks that help support the bigger rocks that are in there, those bigger goals to be satisfied. And then after we've identified those and prioritized their position and scheme in our lives, then we start filling in with sand. And you'll just notice as you do this, the pebbles will fill in spaces between the rocks, the sand will fill spaces between the pebbles, and that might be the equivalent of granular tasks like making phone calls, whereas the outcome of the phone call then feeds the ability of a pebble to write a memo, and then that memo, once it's submitted, might be part of a package requesting funding for a new hire, which would be the ultimate goal or the rock. And then finally, water. That would be the small things in your life, like taking that break, walking around, doing a little bit of exercise to free the mind from, spending 45 minutes or so functioning on something, and let that fill in all the rest of it, so that you're trying to then make sure that at the end of the day, every available amount of space in that jar has been filled up with, working on a goal, the rock, or completing a major task, the pebble, or a small component task like the sand, and then the rest of our life, reading the humorous emails or spending time looking at Facebook, what have you. So this is a conceptual concept that we need to try and think about how we do things, okay? Now, one last thing I'd like to mention here, and this leads to a handout that I included. It's called Jane's Task Log. What we've talked about up to this point is, with the journal, looking into the future. But what you need to do, especially with time management, is also create a log, if you will, where you capture at the end of the day as much of what you have actually done. And for those of you who've got a copy of the hard copy for Jane's task list, it's basically just a list where on the left-hand side there's a column where you'd put in time, and then next to that column would be something called category, and then the activity. And what you'd want to do is, as the example has, is at 8 o'clock, under category of phone, the activity was checked for messages. Then you can start noting how much time you spend on these different types of tasks. Similarly, continuing with Jane's time log, at 8:12, checking the email. Read email, find what's work-related. And according to the example we've got here, with phone conversation checks, or phone messages being checked and email being read, that's the first 20 minutes of Jane's day. So if you were to continue that to include things like travel, socializing, other phone conversations, breaks that you take, people stopping by, etc., at the end of the day, you can start to see where your time actually gets used. Now, unlike the journal, this log is something you might do for a couple of days and then stop it and then review where you found your time being spent. The journal is to be something continued on through your life, almost like when some of you might have written diaries where at the end of the day you said what happened and what you wanted to talk about or plan for the next day. The journal would be continuing. This log would be just done often enough so that you could track and see if anything's creeping in on your time, might be wasting it. So it's not a slide, it's just a handout that you might find of use. And the second page of Jane's time log is a copy of the log document without any information filled in, so you could then, print off several copies and make use for yourself. I hope you find some value in that. One of the key things, again, with logging is we've got to be able to track and know where we're spending our time. What are we doing as the day progresses? I use logs for various and sundry other purposes as well. Okay? So another way of approaching a goal, if you will, is to try and break it into components. I know the thought of going to Disney World for some people may be a major challenge. It's almost like a project that could be considered too big to take on. But if you chunk it, and that idea is to take the trip and break it into perhaps there's travel, then there's home preparation, then there would be an agenda when you get there. Big chunks of the project or the goal of getting to Disney World. Then once you've got those chunked into major components, you can block them off. And an example might be for travel. Okay, how are we going to get down to Orlando? Well, that could be a block that would contain airline reservations. Another block under that chunk could be confirming we've got the funds Another block in travel could be, reading what are the newest FAA rules and regulations on how to pass through security. So in other words, we don't look at going to Disney World in its entirety, but we start breaking it into chunks and then further break those chunks into blocks of tasks. And then finally at the very end, you get down to tackle it. Okay? Now that's a specific task, and those are things that could be put into your journal and scattered over across a week's time to try and accomplish. So this is all another conceptual way of approaching a goal, trying to make it easier. And I'll be perfectly honest, this is one that I use a lot. If I'm given a deliverable that I have to perform over a certain amount of time, I try and break it down into more palatable pieces. First off, it makes my mind a little easier. It makes it so that I can sit there and say, if I accomplish this week and I accomplish that next week, then things will be fine, which is a very emotional issue, which we'll see when we start looking at procrastination. This is a good way to help fight procrastination. Another way of approaching, and this is similarly a conceptual view of things, is what we want to do is kind of like that Nike commercial it came out with where they say, just do it. A lot of people go out and they overplan. We're going to spend the first 3 weeks out of a 4-week deliverables time frame planning, and then we'll spend the last week actually doing the work. No, that's really not where you want to go. You do want to do some planning, but just take some action and then adjust accordingly. Most of us are doing jobs or tasks that we've done in the past, so we should have a pretty good idea as to how to do the granular steps within it. It's just a matter of getting started, breaking the inertia. Okay. And remember, we look back at that 80-20 rule, okay? It's one of the ideas where 80% of the outcome will come from the first 20% of our action. So don't spend all of that action planning when some of it could actually be going out and making something happen. Okay, do some of these ideas, the ready, fire, aim, the chunking, the concept of the rocks in the jar, does this make sense? I'll take hands or check marks. Or if somebody's got questions, we'll take in any chat comments. Okay, I've got most of the hands are in check mark state, which is good. No comments came in, so based on that, let's press on. Tackling procrastination. This is the fun one, the really fun kind of a module to have because we all, unfortunately, are procrastinators in some way, shape, or form. So what we want to do is try and see what we can do about eliminating as much as we can. And again, I just love the quotes that show up here. I'm a great believer in luck, and I find that the harder I work, the more luck I have. Let's hear it for Thomas Jefferson. Okay, why do we procrastinate? Well, in some cases, the issues are forced on us. There is no clear deadline. So it's one of those where, okay, it's something I have to do, but I really don't know when it's due, so it's going to go on the back burner, and I'll fight the fires that are in front of me. A lot of cases, it's also we don't have the adequate resources. There are things we can do when we don't have adequate resources. Generally, one of the first things to do if you're in that situation is you start bouncing it back to those that are up your food chain, simply because they may not even know that you need those resources, and they would get them for you if they only knew. So sometimes when we're tasked with doing something and they are unaware they're more than willing to do the work to get us the resources, but we need to let them know. And also, there's a lot of times when it's, where do we begin? You've got to create a project, and you've never done this before, so you don't have a basis of understanding as to what would be your first steps. Well, that would kind of require perhaps doing some research, reaching out to people who've done that type of work, getting input from them, finding best practices. And a lot of that, when we don't have a clear deadline or we don't have the adequate resources or know where to begin, we start feeling overwhelmed. Some of that could be taken care of with the chunk and the block that we talked about, breaking the big thing into smaller, more manageable bite-sized pieces. Reminded of that old adage, and how does one eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I wouldn't want to spend all of my time eating elephant, but that's the idea is to you break something into its smaller components. And that feeling of overwhelmed then can, if we don't have a passion for it or we have a fear of failure. So a lot of this all deals into why do we sometimes procrastinate. And I've tried to explain how we can deal with some of those things as we went over it. But now we've got a slide where they're going to talk about that in more detail. Some cases, what would happen if we didn't do the task at all? This is going back to perhaps thinking of that 80-20 rule. Maybe it's something that doesn't really need to be done at all. It's part of the SOP that was valid 15 years ago, but no one's looked at the fact that that report we write never goes anywhere. So if it doesn't go anywhere, why do it? Now, do keep in mind you may need to check up your food chain before you just arbitrarily delete something, but you might want to just keep in mind that sometimes it's best to just do away with the step if it's not serving a purpose. Delegate. This is a tough one for a lot of us simply because we don't have the authority to delegate. But keep in mind, if you can't actually delegate or shovel it off onto somebody else, and I did not say shovel, to delegate and give it to somebody else, what you could do instead of delegate is find out who has done this type of work before and ask them for those best practices. How would they start it? Learn from them on how to make your efforts in it better. Then this goes, next one, do it. That goes back to the ready, fire, aim, or the Nike, just do it. Get some momentum. Start doing something. Again, like the delegate where I said, find best practices. In some cases, you just need to ask for advice. Somebody who's done it before. Chop it up. That goes to the chunk block, and then, breaking things into more manageable pieces. Now, the 15-minute rule, that one's kind of interesting. This deals to a degree with the concept of multitasking, if you will, and goes back to that suggestion I said of that one young manager that I knew who actually blocked off 2 hours of her day daily to do things without interruption. It's best if you try and spend at least 15 minutes working on any given task that you've got. So if the task at hand is to read your emails, block off 15 minutes. Don't answer the phone. Let it go to voicemail. Read the emails. Parse through your emails or look through the material that's pertaining to a certain task you've got. If you've got to look at a bunch of memos, block off 15 minutes and devote it and exclusively respond and spend your time on that one task. The next one, clear deadline. Here what they're looking at is if you don't have one, then you're going to have to actually reach out and become assertive and start requesting what are the deadlines. Get clarity on it. I also tend to ask, and what are the ramifications if I don't meet that deadline? A lot of times those ramifications are understandable. If you're handing a project off to somebody else in part of your office, what you're not giving it to them might do more so than anyone in the management chain, but by you having a clear understanding as to when it's due and what the ramifications are if it's not delivered on time, that helps overcome procrastination. Set yourself a reward. Don't be dependent upon someone else rewarding you. And these rewards can be simple, but they've got to be meaningful for you. Make it so that every Friday you've got some kind of a reward coming to yourself for having accomplished X number of whatever. So, have something, the carrot, to look forward to. And then the last one, and we'll talk about this to a small degree in a couple of minutes, is remove distractions. Try and keep perhaps your desk clear so that you're not looking at all these piles of paper when you should be focusing on just one thing. Try and remove as many distractions as possible. That way, it's easier than to focus that 15-minute rule and to just do it. Hopefully that kind of makes some sense. Now, we mentioned distractions. Oops, sorry. I totally blew off an entire important section. Eat that frog. I love this. This is something that I learned without actually knowing what eat the frog meant. Basically, the concept is if you're going to start your day off, what you really want to do is tackle the hardest, the biggest payoff, or the most time-consuming and disliked task. In other words, the idea is if you eat the frog in the morning, that's probably going to be the worst thing you'll have to face for the entire day. What they say here is if you've got to eat two frogs, eat the ugliest one first. Again, the concept is tackle the worst part of your day as soon as you can in the morning. That way you can look at the rest of the day and say, oh, well, I can now start to take it easy. Those other project components, those other chunks, those other tasks, they're not going to be nearly as bad as what I had to do first thing in the morning. It's kind of an interesting concept, but it gives you a real emotional good feeling, if you will, that not that you ate the frog, that's just a kind of a analogy, but that if you tackle the worst thing first, then the rest of the day you figure you can handle it. Does that make sense? I want to see some hands on that one. And if there's any questions, again, this is just a concept. Okay. Anyone got any thoughts about that they'd like to share? I mean, it is an analogy, and the thought of putting a frog in your mouth might be a bit much, but well, at least it's a good idea. I'm willing to take that. Good. Let's see what Liz is going to have to say about it. Or Clifford. They're out there typing. Yeah. Just do it. And if you're going to just do it, get the hardest thing that you have to do off your desk first thing. That's the whole idea. Thank you, Clifford. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that you actually eat frogs. Save me if my evaluations indicate that I'm advocating eating live frogs. But, yeah, good. You got the idea. Now, I want to point you to one of the download files. It's called the Quick Reference Sheets. It's something that you should have received or you could download. It's got a little write-up about this Eat That Frog that, at your leisure you might want to read to revisit the concept. Crisis management. Now, this is not going to go into risk analysis and how do we maintain the agency in the event of a crisis. This is more about looking at the idea that things are going to happen. There's a phrase that kind of goes like, stuff happens. So we've got to be aware that we have to maintain some levels of flexibility. So what can we do? In a crisis, be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity. That is so much of a truism. It's one of those where do you look at the glass as half full or half empty? So what we want to do is identify some steps that you can take, hopefully, to take care of getting you successfully through a abrupt change in your plans for the day. When the storm hits, and notice it's not if the storm hits, they're very pessimistic in the fact that something's going to happen. Okay, so you just try and identify what happened, what were the causes, what's going to happen next.
Sunday, I see.
What events will this impact?
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
And then finally, who else needs to know about this? That last one is the one that I really want you to pay attention to. The reason is, quite often, and this has happened to me a good portion of the time over my careers, I'll get so involved in what's going on in front of me that I don't necessarily always let other people know that, oh, gee, I'm trying to put this particular fire out. So anything that you were expecting from me, yeah, it's going to be a little delayed. So if you take anything out of this particular slide where it talks about things that you need to be aware of doing, it's that last one that has to really, I would suggest you take to home, is identify who else needs to know about this. Because in some cases, there are other folks that maybe had better experience with this storm, type of a storm, and could be of assistance, or they might even be able to take on the entire issue. But if they don't know about it, then they can't be helpful. Once you know a storm's coming or it's arrived, this is one of those things that kind of goes back to the journal, create a plan, develop some kind of way to deal with it. This is more than taking a lot of time that you would for setting a goal and identifying the tasks and all of that. This is something that has to be done in pretty short order. Identify what the problem is, decide what a solution would be, try and chunk it, break it down into parts, and then create a timeline. Some of this may be for stuff that has to be accomplished before the end of the day. It's not going to be as simple always as doing a major goal development for our time management. But do keep in mind also that when these storms hit, you at least can plan for your day. You may not necessarily be able to be in control of changing the plan or creating a agency type plan, but you can at least create a plan how you will succeed in getting from the morning to the afternoon and then back home again. So not all answers will come out from creating a plan when you've got a storm, but at least be aware. And then execute. And this reiterates one of the issues that I mentioned at the very beginning, which was evaluate how well you're going, adapt the plan accordingly, because if you find yourself off course, you need to be able to switch and get back on course. It's one of those where way too often we focus on one thing to the exclusion of changes that go on around us. And then when we finally get there, we find out that, whoops, hey, everyone else went elsewhere, and now we're sitting here all by ourselves. So stay organized and try and be on top of the events. And again, it goes back to communication. Deliver communication to others, letting people know. Lessons learned. Now, this is something that is not storm dependent, and actually pretty much should be built into the initial slides when we were talking about developing goals, making sure that they're smart, etc. And that is once you've reached that goal, take some time and try and figure out what happened. By what happened, I mean not just did a storm occur, but, well, we had planned to deliver X and come to find out that we've reached the goal and we've delivered X and Y. Well, what happened? Why did that happen? Where could we have perhaps planned better in the long run if it's a goal, or in mitigating the challenges from a storm? Lessons learned. Why did something happen? That's always a big question that we need to spend a few moments or actually develop a process to do. And this is also where that log that I had mentioned, Jane's log, as one of the handouts, a good way of trying to track things that occur so you can remember what happened. And then what can we learn from it? If we found out that contacting so-and-so is not the best way to, move a project forward to reach a goal or to get around the effects of a storm, then who do we need to contact the next time? And prepare for it. Update an SOP, update your Rolodex, update your contact list, what have you. But learn from what occurred and prepare for the next time. Otherwise, there's that old saying, insanity is continuing to do the same thing, but expecting different results. We need to be able to be flexible and adapt. Organizing your workspace. I mentioned that this was going to be one of those things for procrastination that we would take care of. How do we make our days go better? Okay. The only thing, even in this world, is the number of hours in a day. The difference in winning or losing is what you do with those hours. Now, I'll be honest, for me, I'm pretty much a messy person. Anyone who's ever visited my office, things usually look askance. And I wish I could say that I knew where everything was. I don't live in such a well-coordinated clutter. So for me, one of the things when I start a new project is I try and go out and clean off my desk, to declutter it, if you will. It gives a good starting point for any new goal or project. And one of the suggestions we've got here when we're talking about decluttering, and this could be applicable to paper, of which I usually have piles of paper, or some cases emails, okay, that form of electronic storage, and then also just general files, like on the PC. What you need to do is try and break them into 3 different groups. One is what's working, what's pertaining to the frequently needed to be close at hand. If I'm constantly responding to people in the districts, well, having a list of who those people's names are and their emails, that would be considered a working document, so that I'd be able to reach out to them at a moment's notice. Reference, okay? Some things, whether they're emails, they're paper or electronic documents, they're only needed occasionally. And for myself, I'm encountering this a lot at home when it comes to the books that I use. My particular job, dealing with organizations and employee development, I'm dependent upon a lot of material that is created by other people who do research. But unfortunately, that research is sometimes outdated, it's no longer valid, or it's just not useful for me, but it still takes up space. So things that are in reference, they're used only occasionally, you develop a pile for them. And then finally, there is a misprint. Slide says achieve. Actually, what it should say is archive. Bummer. Okay. Archive is basically material seldom retrieved but must be kept. It could be one of those things where it's required as record management, or in my case, it's something that I just may need again, but it's painful because in a lot of cases I have to go through the archive stuff and just throw away, simply because we continually creating more. But if you can at least grasp taking the emails, the files on your PC, and the hard copy material and breaking it into these three different classifications, working reference and archive, then you can start to get a handle on maintaining your workspace. Okay? Another approach with this is managing the workflow. Select one task to do at a time. This goes back to that in conjunction with time yourself, designating a certain period to do something exclusively. It could be 15 minutes, as we suggested in the procrastination 15-minute rule. Could be like that one manager I mentioned who had that 2-hour block of time. You devote your time to exclusively that issue, ignore everything else, don't allow breaks or interruptions, and it says give yourself a reward at the end. The reward is optional. I like to think of the fact that the reward is having accomplished more in that 15 minutes than I would if I had just let things pile up. Now, for those of you who like acronyms, and there's lots of people out here who like to use them, there's an acronym called STING, S-T-I-N-G. I didn't create a slide for it, but I guess I could have. Select, yes, one task to do at a time. Time yourself using a clock, okay? No more than an hour. Ignore everything else during the time. No breaks or interruptions. And then give yourself a reward. So that's STING. Could have underlined, made bolder, what have you. Dealing with email. Email, best handled in batches. That's the reference where they're talking about trying to do it in blocks of time. So, you set a certain time to do. In certain cases, setting up delivery rules. What they're talking about here is dealing with getting email out, let's say, every morning. Rules for yourself on how you're going to make sure that you get things out the door. And create folders for different topics or different people by projects, etc. You can create rules when we're talking about delivery where you want to know that somebody has received something, set return receipt. That doesn't guarantee that they actually will read it. And in some cases, their mail client will allow them to override letting you know. But still, use a rule as best you can. One thing I'm finding with Outlook that's very handy is there's a field called category. I'm not going to show you how to do it, but categories in Outlook allow you to put a color code, if you will, on an email. So if I know I've got something that I'm going to have to come back to, I've set up the inbox, if you will, or even other folders with a category on the left-hand side, and I'll just click a color. That means I can then quickly scan through, several hundred emails and look for the color coding to know that I need to take care of this and then move on. Sometimes you get emails that you need to address, but you've got more pressing issues. So it's just a way of kind of like putting a highlighter on them. So look into Outlook and see what some of the options are that could help you. One of the rules also that I use, briefly, is I've configured my email so it has a 2-minute delay in sending. The idea behind that is how often do we send emails and then go, oops, I didn't mean to say that, or I didn't mean to include this. So I've built in a 2-minute delay on anything that I post out, and it just sits in a outbox, allowing me that 2 minutes to try and think, did I really want to send it? Otherwise, it then goes out the door. Just a thought. Outlook's got lots of capabilities if we try and spend the time to learn them. Using calendars, we understand that. It's usually one of the best ways to set up meetings. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. Just passing on calendars. Setting rituals. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept. Rituals, routines, they serve several functions. One is to help increase the spontaneity, it says, and fun in life, because you've got something to look forward to. Okay, routine tasks can be something that will also help get you closer to your goals. So, what are we talking about? Well, a ritual by Random House is any practice or pattern of behavior regularly performed in a set manner. What they're suggesting for a ritual, setting it up, is identify time so that, okay, before I go to bed tonight, I will always lay out tomorrow's clothes. Okay, when do I do it? I do it at night before I go to bed. What's the task? Well, I lay my clothes out. What are the subtasks? I've got to think of what do I need to wear the next day. Okay, so it's breaking, again, something big, in this case a single ritual, into subcomponents or chunks, if you will, and create that. Okay, glad someone liked the categories. That's good. Rituals. Here's an example. Ritualizing sleep, meals, and exercise. Establish a ritual. Plan meals for the next week. Try to exercise, etc. One of the nice things about developing rituals, if I could say on myself, and here's some examples, is that in some cases rituals will maximize time because finally rituals, if you think about it, could become good work habits. And then if they're done often enough and they serve you well enough, they just become a part of the way that you do things. So, rituals to maximize time. During a break, maybe you need to read something that's totally different from what you're doing. Doing deep breathing. I said get up every 45 minutes from your chair and walk around. Clean off that small area. In other words, once you finish a task, clean up after yourself. Update your journal or update the log. So some of these things we're looking at here are, develop routines, and they in turn can become these rituals that you, in some cases, could look for. Okay, set aside that lunch hour for personal errands or for meeting with people or spending time on Facebook, what have you. So again, the rituals could become then better work habits. Meeting management, we're going to blow through this one because most of us really don't control setting the meetings up. But you do have to keep in mind that as a player in any meeting, you do have an impact on it. So one of the key things that tends to not happen in meetings is determining who needs to be there. Participants have to make decisions. Observers just need to know about them. You can't always control that, but if we're sending out the minutes, that would be something. Here's a concept called the PAT approach. Purpose, agenda, and time. What's the purpose of the meeting? What's the agenda? What are the things to be discussed? And then how much time are we going to give it? Is that reasonable? Let's see. Building the agenda. Well, you're going to have to call people together. What's the topics to be discussed, and then any kind of a wrap-up. Keeping things on track. We don't always have the ability because we don't always know that there's an agenda. But we try and stick to it, or we can, chime in if we're not running the meeting. Are we off topic? Follow up on missed items. Make an agreement that we're at the end and that we have missed things. So, you may not be running it, but again, you can at least participate. Making sure the meeting was worthwhile. This is where it's kind of suggested that there be minutes given out from meetings. Okay, that would be the summary, so that people who couldn't attend or those people who just need to be kept up on things are aware. alternatives to meetings. Some of these will be available to us using chat rooms. Well, we can use things like Adobe Connect. That's one alternative to actually having meetings. We've got the AT&T service for having conference calls. But we need to have, ground rules and an agenda on all of those. Teleconferencing, we're doing that. Interactive whiteboards, this is recordable. Screen sharing. Groups. Collaborative applications, SharePoint, we make use of that. We don't really have a lot of other collaborative opportunities. We are the government after all. Not that we don't like collaborative tools, it's just sometimes they give more capabilities than should be intended. So we have to be careful of what we make use of. Wrapping things up as I get closer to the time. Workshop's coming to an end. See what did Henry Ford have to say for us? Been his observation that most people get ahead during the time that others waste time. And it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. Words for the wise. Harvey McKay. Time is free, but it's priceless. You can't own it, but you can use it. You can't keep it, but you can spend it. And once you've lost it, you can never get it back. Okay. 3 others. I'm not going to read them. They're there for you. References. The AgLearn has a lot of material on time management, some of which you actually have received in the handouts that I gave you. Google and a ton of other sources. We do have the evaluation that Kimberly mentioned. The intent is once I close out this particular meeting, your browser should automatically be rerouted to the SurveyMonkey location. If it's not, the link is on the slide, which you have in the handouts that were emailed yesterday or that you downloaded today, plus the bottom of Kimberly's email that she sent out with the logistical details on this presentation. With that, I've got Lisa typing something in, and I'm going to open up the lines because my part of this has been finished.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Well, someone decided not to finish typing, but the lines are open. If anyone's got any comments, suggestions, I'm open to hearing. Otherwise, we'll have the evaluations that we'll look forward to reading from you all. Thank you very much for your time. Kimberly, have you got any closing comments?
Well, we'll wait. It looks like someone may be in the chat box, but we do want to hear if you have any questions. And if not, I would like to give a special thanks to Tom. This was a great presentation. I have my notes on things that I can definitely work on, as I assume others have done as well. Tom has mentioned the evaluation. If you could complete that, that is very much appreciated. And if you kind of step away and end up thinking of a question at a later time, always feel free to email me, respond to the email that I sent out yesterday, or if you want to contact Tom directly, we are happy to take any questions. It does look like we have one question in the chat box. We just start with a few items that we know we can tackle.
I would suggest yes to that. The idea is whenever you start anything, you always want to be successful. It kind of puts a damper on wanting to do more of something if you fail. So I would suggest you start with a few items that you know you can deal with and that you can accomplish what you're looking for. then you can start branching out once you get comfortable using some of the ideas. Plus, I think I mentioned at the beginning, not all of these ideas are going to work equally well for everybody. We all have different personalities. We all approach work in different ways. So some of these will work better for others than some. So, find what works for you, make sure it's going to do what you want, and then branch out and start looking for those frogs to eat.
Well, I think we will end with that. Thank you again, Tom, and thank you all for participating today, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Have a great day.
Bye-bye, everyone.